Let's just do a quick review on what we explored last class. This slide is reminding us that line can be used to imply three-dimensional form. So we don't see any value in the form of shading on these apples, but the artist has used curvy contour lines to describe the three-dimensional form of the apples and thereby create the illusion of form in the drawing, much like I did with this eel. So the version on the left is showing the eel looking fairly three-dimensional because of the value gradations that I added, the shading that I added, but then I still achieved a fairly three-dimensional look to the eel in the version on the right by using curved contour lines that are investigating the three-dimensional structure of the eel. So we practiced in class taking a mountain shape like this and then adding lines with a focus on two aspects in particular, and that was changing the orientation of the line like we see on the right hand side, changing the angle in order to start to imply three-dimensional form, and then also changing the density of the line. When we make our lines closer together, we thereby give the appearance of a darker value, shadows, and so that is based on this reference photo. So the right side of this piece of mountain was much darker than the left side, and so I used a tighter density of lines on that part of the drawing. So this assignment that you're going to work on is based on Vincent van Gogh, a very popular 19th century, late 19th century artist in the post-impressionistic movement. And we're familiar with this painting of his, Starry Night, and we know that one of Van Gogh's characteristics, one of his stylistic attributes, is that he used to use aggressive brush strokes and let the brush strokes show in his artwork. And when we look at his drawings, we see a similar approach where we see individual lines being applied almost like brush strokes. I also want to remind you that what we see Van Gogh doing here also is using different styles of lines. So shorter lines on the field where we see the swaths that were cut, and then longer vertical lines in the distant crop that's still standing, and then little almost stippling lines in the sky. Here's another example. So a landscape has different visual components, right? Like there's a grass and straw and a fence, trees, sky, mountains, buildings. And so by using lines in a different orientation, some horizontal, like down here near the bottom, some vertical, like we see with this, looks like a fence, and then some at angles in this haystack, Van Gogh was able to differentiate one part of the scene from another. And that's what I want you to do. So I'm just going to fast forward a little bit here. There's an interesting version of Starry Night as a drawing. Like maybe that would have been a preliminary sketch that Van Gogh did in preparation for the painting. But look at how he was able to still create a lot of movement in the sky with a strategic orientation of his lines. So step number one for you is to take a piece of the project paper that's been left for you on one of the long tables, and tape it to an artboard. When we create artwork on paper, we tape it to artboards. The artboards are in the back storage room down here. Orange arrow on the floor. Like this. Take a piece of tape, de-stickify it a little bit by putting it down on your desk and lifting it up about 6, 7, or 8 times just to get some of the tack off the tape so that when the tape is removed, once the artwork is complete, the paper will not tear. Then put it down on the paper and board so that half of the tape is gripping the paper and half of the tape is gripping the board. 50-50. You don't need to measure or use a ruler. Just eyeball it. And then repeat that process 3 more times so that the paper is taped down on all 4 sides. Remember, half and half, 50-50. Now you're ready to make art. Then take your reference photo, which you brought maybe on your phone, or you're going to access it on a Chromebook, which you can get from the 2300 Learning Community, Mrs. Robinson's area. And step number 1 is to draw the basic shapes that you see in your landscape. I guess it's step number 2 here. So step number 1 is to actually have the photo in front of you. And then you may notice that this slide says draw a large box on your drawing paper, blah, blah, blah. So you don't have to do that. We've taken a little bit of a different approach with it this time, with this project this time. I've cut project paper for you, which you are going to tape to an artboard. And then, as you know, you might have to add a 5th piece of tape to create the specific shape of format that matches the photo that you're working from. Once you're ready to begin drawing your landscape like Van Gogh artwork, you might realize that the shape of the paper that I've pre-cut for you is not the same shape as the landscape photo that you have as a reference. So all you need to do is take another piece of tape and add it to the top or bottom. Let's say that your reference photo is narrower. That's like wide and narrow landscape. Add another piece at the bottom. Don't forget to de-stickify the tape, or maybe even add 2 more pieces in order to make that format a little bit narrower. But you shouldn't add more than 1 or 2 pieces because we don't want to make the paper overall smaller. We just want to modify the length to width ratio a little bit, change the shape a little bit. Once you do all that, step 2 is to draw in the basic landscape features. Like, so in my photo here, we have like the lake, trees, the mountain, the sky, some clouds. There's my son in a kayak. So we see those basic shapes in my first stage here of my drawing. But I was careful to, depict them accurately with the correct size and proportions and contours, like the top of the mountains and, the billowy clouds. And then it's time, step 3, to add a wide range of line styles in order to represent different parts of the landscape. So I used a long horizontal lyrical line for the water. I used a short dashed vertical line for the trees, and then in the trees and closer to the viewer, I used almost like a loopy columnar type line. I used alternating lines in the mountains where I changed the orientation to create that 3D appearance of the rock. And then I used different line style in the clouds. So just like Van Gogh did. I also want you to examine your reference photo closely and ask yourself where you see darker shadows, and where you do see those darker values. Remember, value is the lightness or darkness of a color. So I see darker greens in the trees, for instance, on the far right and on the far left. And so I used a greater density of line on those parts of my drawing in order to create a little bit of value variation. And if you have a focal point in your photo, like I do in this photo of my son in the kayak, try to really make it stand out. And you can do that by making parts of it dark or keeping the area around it plane. So that's it. Have fun with this Van Gogh inspired drawing project. And remember that at the end of class, store your board in the back storage room, upright in those slots like I showed you last class. Take care.